number of people, nearly 50 people joining us already. We'll obviously have people continuing to tick in the coming minutes, but I'll start tonight by saying thank you all for joining me, joining Mark and me, and acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and any elders who we have with us tonight. You're probably all pretty familiar with Zoom webinar forums by now, but I will go through the housekeeping. Please keep yourself on mute, and then we will have a Q&A function. So put your questions in the chat box. You can do that while Mark's speaking or afterwards, and I'll moderate through those questions and put as many of them as I can to Mark in the hour that we have. And it is fantastic to have Mark Dreyfus joining us tonight for this community discussion about the need for a national anti-corruption commission. It is something that is so important, and there's actually no one better, obviously, than Mark to discuss it with his experience, both professionally as a QC, also as a former Attorney General, and now as our Shadow Attorney General. And I was thinking into the discussion for tonight that we've had a huge interest in this topic. And that's so right, I think, at the moment, because never before have we been looking to put so much trust in government as we are at the moment. Government is so important in our lives. And when we're looking to put trust in government, what we need to know is that government is doing the right thing. And obviously, one of the things that helps us know whether government is doing the right thing or not is a body that's set up to look into and investigate corruption, and to do that investigation properly. And as we know, what the Morrison government has been proposing, now that they've been dragged to having some form of an anti-corruption commission, is not a body that would do that properly. So I'm going to let Mark take us through both that, but also through Labor's proposal, because I think it's really important and is a demonstration of how Labor wants to do government differently, that we have made this commitment to a national anti-corruption commission. So Mark, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'll hand over to you on that and let you take us through it.
Thanks very much, Kate. And can I thank you very much for organising this. It's great to see the level of interest. I'm going to thank you for the personal reason that it's going to give me an hour not to think about COVID, and an hour not to talk about COVID, which is, of course, the issue on everybody's minds. I'd also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're on and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The reason I think that so many people have joined this webinar tonight is because there is, in fact, a tremendous wish on the part of people right across Australia to see the Commonwealth join the 6 states and the 2 territories which have all had an anti-corruption commission for some years, and in the case of some states for over 30 years. So it's an idea that's become really familiar to Australians, and people know that anti-corruption commissions work. People know that anti-corruption commissions work to achieve higher standards in government, work to build public confidence in government, because people know that if they see something going wrong or suspect something is going wrong, or the Auditor General comes up with some example of something that looks like corrupt conduct, then it doesn't have to stop at the Auditor General, who really only looks at certain financial aspects. It can go to an independent anti-corruption commission headed by someone who is independent of all political parties, headed by someone in particular who's independent of government, who will investigate. And it's an idea that it's well past the time at which the Commonwealth should have joined the 6 states and the 2 territories in having its own anti-corruption commission. I'm a bit reminded of something that I was able to do when we were last in government, when I was Attorney General, and that is to make the Commonwealth finally have a scheme of whistleblower protection, which of course is a bit related to anti-corruption activities. The Commonwealth, after the 11 and a half years of the Howard government, still didn't have an whistleblower protection scheme. Every state and territory by that time had a whistleblower protection scheme. And one of the advantages that it gave the Commonwealth in being last is that it enabled us to come along in government. We didn't get around to doing it until the very end of the Gillard government. I introduced the legislation and it passed the Parliament in the first 6 months of 2013. But the fact that the Commonwealth was last let us take the best features of the schemes of each of the 6 states and 2 territories. And it's the same here with this Anti-Corruption Commission. We are able to learn from the mistakes that have been made, because none of these is perfect. It's not possible to have this sort of Anti-Corruption Commission without occasionally something going wrong, any more than it's possible to have a judicial system. We'd all like to think that every court in Australia and every judge in Australia is perfect and we deliver perfect justice through our criminal justice system or our civil justice system. Sadly, you all know that that's not the case, but we don't chuck out. I mention this because sometimes people will point to various errors or various problems that have arisen with anti-corruption commissions and say, look at what happened in New South Wales, or look at what happened in Queensland. We don't want to have something at the Commonwealth level because something goes wrong. That's not something we say against the judicial system. We know that all human systems occasionally have things that go wrong in them. It's not a reason for not having it. It is a reason to pay close attention to the design features of an anti-corruption commission and get it as right as we possibly can. I'm trying not to speak for too long because I really want to go to questions and then I'll be answering the things that people want to hear about. But I want to say a little bit about the history of this, a little bit about our proposal, and a little bit about the government's, where the government's got to. We committed to this in January 2018. So more than 3 years ago, we took a very clearly defined proposal to the 2019 election, and I was very proud to have worked on it. And unlike the very large array of policies we took to the 2019 election, this one is a policy that we have recommitted to in the clearest possible way. We recommitted to it as early as September 2019, when I went to the press club after the election and recommitted Federal Labor to bringing in an anti-corruption commission if we are elected at the next election. That remains our commitment. Some 3 weeks back, we re-announced some slightly redesigned design principles to make it clear not only that we are committed, but that we are continuing to listen to the very large number of people in Australia that have offered us comments, the very large number of people, including a whole bunch of retired judges and the Australia Institute and the Centre for Public Integrity and a whole lot of other bodies in Australia that are interested in integrity and interested in accountability and want to see us do this. They've made lots and lots of suggestions, which I hope I've taken on board, and collectively we have recommitted to doing this. There's a very sharp contrast with the government. I think Morrison and his former Attorney General, Christian Porter, understood in the lead up to the last election that there is a deep desire on the part of Australians to have a national anti-corruption commission. And that's why they actually did commit to having one in December of 2018. Well, we're coming up to 1,000 days on the 8th of September from that commitment having been made. And of course, all of you know, because you're interested in this topic, we don't have a National Anti-Corruption Commission in Australia. We've had a discussion paper and we've had an exposure draft of a bill from this government, but they are not looking any closer to legislating. And indeed, we learned at the last session of Senate estimates from officials of the Attorney General's Department that they are not going to legislate before the next election. So a whole term of Parliament will have passed without Morrison keeping the promise that he made to the Australian people before the last election to do a National Anti-Corruption Commission. What we have had, and this should give it, and I'll finish on this point, but this should give everybody real concern. If they were to bring legislation to the Parliament, there is every indication from everything that Morrison has said on the subject, everything that the former Attorney General Christian Porter said on the subject, and everything that his successor Senator Cash has said on the subject, that the model that this Liberal government would bring in would be hopelessly inadequate. It'd be hopelessly inadequate for a whole range of reasons. I'll just list a few of them. First of all, it wouldn't look back into the past. They have said very directly it would only take effect prospectively in the future from the date on which the legislation was passed. It would be extraordinarily limited in what it could look at. They've proposed a ridiculous model with two divisions, one which would be a quite harsh regime applying to police officers, and another much gentler, lesser regime applying to federal ministers, federal politicians, and federal senior public servants. It would set a very, very high threshold for the Commission to investigate. And again, one of the things we've learned from the experience of the state and territory anti-corruption commissions is that if you set too high a threshold, then huge numbers of matters are simply going to not be investigated. And that defeats, in large part, the purpose of having these kinds of commissions in the first place. Instead, what we're proposing is a much more broad-based commission that would have the discretion to look at anything that looked like it was systemic or serious corruption, and the discretion would rest with the Commissioner. I think I might leave it there, Kate, and I'd commend to everybody the principles that we've published. They're on the ALP's website. And you can also go to Kate. She's happy to provide you with more detail, but I'm happy to answer questions on any aspect of this, including our criticisms of the scheme as far as we can understand it that the government's proposing. If you think I'm being very harshly critical of the government, I'd suggest to you that I've in fact been mild. I have avoided talking to you about the huge, literally huge number of scandals that have beset this government in its 8 years of operation. The reason I don't want to talk about that is that I think it's a bit of a distraction. What we're proposing here is not something that says the Liberals need investigation or the Liberals are terrible and Labor's not. We are proposing something that will be there for all time, that will look at all governments, all administrations, whether they be Liberal governments or Labor governments. We, in contrast to the Liberals, want to do something about this. And it's a very important commitment that we're taking to the next election. I'm very proud of the model that we've put forward. I'm looking forward to winning the next election. And one of the achievements of the next Labor government is going to be bringing in a strong, independent and clear anti-corruption commission to operate at the national level. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you, Mark. That was really comprehensive, and we still have a lot of questions, so I will make sure we get through as many of those as possible, and just say that I think you're so right on that defining difference between what we're proposing, what Morrison seems to have on the table, and the commitment to governing differently that Labor is putting in here. The first question I'll ask you comes from Alex, and it goes to some of those questions around what is in Labor's proposal. So Alex asks, what's Labor's position on a consistent definition of what constitutes corrupt conduct across parliamentarians, public servants, and law enforcement employees? And is there any risk in the approach taken by the government in relation to these differing definitions?
We think it needs to be a broad definition. We've used the term in our material, in our principles, to say serious and systemic corruption. And the reason for that is that there's always a risk, and we've seen this from some of the state commissions that they end up investigating matters which are too minor. And that's not what the purpose of these commissions is. But it should be a broad definition. And you can contrast the approach that we would wish to take with the approach that the government's discussion paper talked of and their exposure draft bill has in it, which is to limit the commission to investigating only when it forms a reasonable suspicion that a particular criminal offence has been committed. Now, that is a really, really high threshold. It would guarantee that very many matters would just never be investigated. You don't have to take my word for it. Retired Court of Appeal Judge Tony Wheely, who's the head of Transparency International, made exactly that comment. Professor Anne Toomey from the University of New South Wales, a very noted legal expert on administration and government matters in Australia, has said exactly the same thing. That their concern, it's one I share, is that if the government's model were introduced, very many matters that people would want to see investigated wouldn't be investigated. It shouldn't be linked to the commission of a criminal offence. We have a system that investigates criminal offences. It's called police and courts. And obviously, if the commission discovers that or believes that a criminal offence has been committed, it's not its job to find guilt. It's not its job to sentence someone to a term of imprisonment. What the commission would do, like all of the state commissions do, is to refer the matter to the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions and the police for further investigation. So there's a sharp difference there, and it's a really, really important question that when you are introducing a commission that you have to decide. Is it going to be linked in some way, as Morrison's model has, to commission of criminal offences, or is it broader than that? We think it should be broader.
Mark, what about being retrospective? Jenny's asked if a Labor government's elected, or in fact, Jenny said when a Labor government is elected and introduces this body, would it be retrospective?
Of course. We think it's an absurd suggestion. And I am suspicious that one of the reasons why Mr. Morrison has opted for this link to a criminal offence is that it enabled his former Attorney General, Christian Porter, to talk about a known principle in relation to criminal law, which is that the parliaments, as a rule, shouldn't introduce retrospective criminal offences. In other words, shouldn't make something criminal in the past if it wasn't criminal at the time. Now, that is hopelessly confused. That is not what we are talking about here. We don't want this limited to criminal offences. So no question of retrospectivity comes up. We want corruption in government to be investigated. And roughly the period that I have had in mind is around a decade, that perhaps you shouldn't be able to go back into the distant past, but certainly around 10 years from the date of introduction of the commission seems to me to be an appropriate period. That, as it happens at the moment, would capture a period of Labor government as well. And there's something to be said for that.
Okay. Absolutely. I mean, it doesn't seem to make sense to say we're starting from day zero and move on from there. A question from Scott, Mark, about how Labor's proposed commission would be funded. Would it be funded through an independent stream so that it's operating without fear, much as what seems to happen to the Attorney General at the moment, that the budget maybe isn't increased as needed or it's cut if the government of the day doesn't like what it's doing?
I hadn't seen that as necessary. I think that once this commission is established, it's right to be concerned about its resourcing. It's right to be concerned that it's not going to be cut off at the knees by some future government by having less funding than it needs. But I think there's quite a lot of affection for these anti-corruption commissions now across Australia. And I think that there would be an immense political risk for any government which so reduced the funding of its anti-corruption commission that it couldn't do its work properly, the independent commissioner would immediately start talking about that publicly. And indeed, we have seen commissioners in a number of the states making public comment on their funding level in their reports to Parliament, and you have to provide for the commissioner to have a direct relationship with the Parliament. The commissioners say, we don't have enough money to investigate the kinds of things that we've now got allegations about. So I think that tension would be sufficient to make sure that your commission's going to be able to operate, that there'd be a heavy political price for reducing resources, and it's not necessary. It's a bit awkward in our system of government to provide for some separate stream. You'd have to work out where it's coming from. Money at the Commonwealth level comes from consolidated revenue, and we have single budgets.
Another question, Mark, about whether the body would be able to instigate its own reviews, or would it rely on that referral coming from government? Again,
that's a really useful question. It differs from state to state. And there's a problem with the model that Morrison's put forward in respect of allegations against ministers and departments. Unless there was a referral from government under their model, the Commission couldn't investigate. Now, that is an absurd limitation on the type of commission that we have in mind here. Our view is that it should be able to act on its own motion. It should be able to decide to inquire into something if it sees something, or if it sees a report by the Auditor General. Equally, and it's important that it be able to act on anonymous complaints. Some state commissions are not permitted to act on anonymous complaints. I don't see any reason why there should be such a limitation. I think the Commission should be given a broad discretion to investigate anything that it wishes, provided it's of the view that it's serious and systemic corruption. And it doesn't matter, and it shouldn't matter, where it gets the idea to do it from.
And Mark, follow up from that, I think a few questions in the box there around scope in terms of whether the proposal would include the Commission being able to look into state matters, or if that's covered off at the state level.
You get into I'm going to bore everybody for a moment. You get into a constitutional problem here.
This is why we're asking you, Mark.
Yeah. It's called the Melbourne Corporation Principle, and it's a principle that the High Court has repeatedly applied since 1953 that says that the Commonwealth is not to interfere in what's called the sphere of government of states, and the states are not to interfere in what's called the sphere of government of the Commonwealth. So you'll find that there's a clear limitation on the state anti-corruption commissions. They're not allowed to go and inquire into a Commonwealth government matter. The Commonwealth Anti-Corruption Commission would similarly not be allowed to go and inquire into the operation of a state government. But what you should do is provide referral mechanisms. You need to have, there's a whole range of integrity bodies already at the Commonwealth level, but they're siloed. So there's a body called the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, who looks at the intelligence agencies, and she or he would need to have a cross-referral mechanism with this Anti-Corruption Commission. And equally, if the National Anti-Corruption Commission became aware of some corruption that was occurring at the state level, it should have in its legislation the ability to refer that to the relevant state commission.
Okay. And again, a theme that's coming through on the proposal is around staffing and who would staff the commission, whether you have a particular body you would be thinking to draw staff from. ACLEI, which I think is the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity. Did I get that acronym right? I think we've got a few AFP officers on the chat tonight. Yeah. And the AFP, or more broadly, and also a question which is tied to that around whether you think there is a workforce to draw from this type of commission, whether you'd be competing for staff against the states there.
You definitely would be competing for staff with the states, but I do think everyone should take heart. There is a pool of people in Australia who are experienced investigators. Some of them work for state police forces. Some of them work for the Australian Federal Police. Some of them work for the Commissioner for Law Enforcement Integrity, who you've just mentioned. Some of them work for Inspectors General in various parts of the Commonwealth. Some of them work for the Tax Department. So there is a pool of experienced investigators. There's a pool of experienced lawyers, criminal lawyers. Some of them are barristers. Some of them work for as prosecutors at various directors of public prosecutions. So there's a range of people from whom we would draw the staff of this commission. Equally, there's a pool of experienced men and women in Australia who could become the commissioner, and if we chose that model, deputy commissioners as well. By and large, and this has been the experience at the state and territory level, the commissioners have been drawn from the ranks of retired judges. Not always. Some commissioners have been people who have served as directors of public prosecutions, but they are pretty much almost always lawyers, but senior lawyers, people that have been around for some decades. And some of the most successful commissioners have in fact been retired judges. Thinking the late David Ip, who died last year, who was the Commissioner of the New South Wales ICAC and led the inquiries into Eddie Obeid and Ian McDonald.
Okay. And Mark, I'll ask you another question about the scope of what Labor's proposing, and then I might move on and shift focus a bit to some of the questions around issues the Morrison government is facing and what makes Labor different. So Matthew Peterson's asked, noting that members of the AFP and other law enforcement agencies are currently subject to oversight by the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity, is Labor's proposal to bring the wider public service and parliamentarians up to an equivalent standard?
At least up to that standard, at least. It's really important that we have accountability mechanisms that set standards. Maybe if you go back some decades, and I'm not singling out Labor or Liberal governments, you could find a time in Australian government, Australian political history, when there was a more commonly understood set of standards, and those standards were enforced, when we had a real concept of ministerial responsibility, when we had a real understanding of standards of conduct by ministers, by senior public servants, and when they were discovered to have slipped below those standards, there were consequences. Sadly, and this is a direct and partisan criticism of the Morrison government, they don't seem to have any standards, because when breaches of standards are discovered, and I'm not talking about illegal conduct, I'm not talking about the commission of criminal offences, I'm talking about standards in government. When we discover a minister or a senior public servant that has slipped below those standards, nothing happens. That has been the pattern of the Morrison government throughout its time. It's possible to go back to the Turnbull government and see that on occasions, Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister was prepared to sack a minister who had not performed in accordance with what I would hope to be commonly understood standards of conduct. But under Morrison, nothing. We have had no enforcement of standards at all. So it makes all the more urgent as a means of restoring standards that we have this National Anti-Corruption Commission.
It's absolutely a theme, isn't it? That lack of consequences, as you say, and Morrison taking any action against bad behaviour. And I know that you, like me, feel so frustrated and angry being in the building and seeing ministers behave in this way and not face any consequence. And it's probably a good segue there into what some of the chat has been around, which is around some of the issues the Morrison government is facing. So the Leppington Triangle, sports rorts, car park rorts. Are these the type of issues that we would anticipate this type of body would look into?
I'll take the Leppington Triangle because it's a sharper example of something that, in my opinion, a National Anti-Corruption Commission would definitely look at. And just to recap for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it became clear from an Auditor General's report that the Morrison government, possibly even earlier than the Morrison government, but in fact, it might have been under the time of the Turnbull government, but it came to light in an Auditor General's report about 18 months ago that the Morrison government or the Turnbull government had paid $30 million for a piece of land valued at $3 million. It was a piece of land acquired for the purposes of the Western Sydney Airport, the second international airport for Sydney, and there has not been a single consequence following on from that report. There has been no further investigation following on from that report, and it demonstrates about as sharply as you could want to demonstrate why a National Anti-Corruption Commission is warranted, because it stinks. The people who received that money were donors of the Liberal Party. And we've got a Commonwealth government that's paid 10 times more than land was worth. Now, I want to know more about that. But at the moment, we've had a blanket refusal by the government to look further at it. We've had a shrugging of the shoulders of the Prime Minister and the Minister responsible, Paul Fletcher, who is not responsible at all. He actually signed a brief that authorised this to happen. And we've got his signature on it, but no, I'm not responsible, seems to be their attitude. That's a relatively small amount of money compared to the amounts of money that have been splashed around by, and this is Morrison, in both the car park rorts scandal, I'll call it that, and the sports rorts scandal. Both of them involved prime ministerial direction using coloured spreadsheets out of the Prime Minister's office that directed public money in aid of the Liberal Party's re-election. And it's shocking just to state it, but nobody has suffered any consequence for this behaviour. The single exception was Bridget McKenzie, who was made to be the fall guy for the sports rorts scandal. But carefully, they found an imagined breach by her of the statement of ministerial standards, and she was made to resign. Her imagined sin was to give a $32,000 grant to a gun club in Wangaratta that had made her an honorary member. Now, speaking personally, I don't see that as a conflict of interest because she'd only visited the club once. She wasn't a member in any real sense. They'd made her an honorary member. I have been made an honorary member of lots of things around Australia, but it doesn't give me a conflict of interest. It's just a kind of courtesy. She was made to resign. She's now back in cabinet. And it's extraordinary to think of how little this government cares for standards. There has never been an investigation by any public authority. Morrison pretended at one point to refer sports rorts to an investigation by a man that used to be his chief of staff, but is now the head of his department, Mr. Getchins. No one's ever seen the result of this inquiry. No one's even clear that there has been an inquiry, but Morrison, our Prime Minister, said there was going to be, and it would be conducted by Phil Getchins. The latest one, car parks, is still unfolding. It is $660 million of public money directed to improving the Liberals' prospects of re-election at the 2019 election. It's scandalous at multiple levels. I'll shut up soon, Kate. I get excited talking about it. It's so
this is there's a number of questions on this, Mark. So I think it's fine for us to go through this. Yeah,
the car park rort is a good example of something that might or might not amount to serious and systemic corruption. Unlike the land scandal, the Leppington Triangle land, which is much more clearly to me something warranting investigation, the car park rort might be simply very, very bad government. And Morrison has kind of tried to defend this by saying, oh, well, it's a good idea to build these car parks, commuter car parks around stations that we want people to get on the train at. And at the moment, you can't find a place to park your car. One can understand the public policy rationale behind building commuter car parks. What I've said about this is that it might amount to corruption if it's such a gross level of misuse of public funds and a gross level of maladministration. And it's going to be a matter for the National Anti-Corruption Commission to determine. I'm not going to predetermine it, but it certainly should be investigated. And again, because we've presently got a national government in Australia that just wants to brush everything under the carpet and not investigate anything, again, you've got a very good demonstration of why having a National Anti-Corruption Commission is a good idea, because it gives confidence to people that there's somewhere to go to complain, that there's somewhere you can go and ask for matters to be investigated, and they will be investigated by an independent authority. At the moment, we don't have that. In fact, we've got a government that's running away in the opposite direction, making sure that things don't get investigated and making sure things are covered up.
Mark, this is a good follow-on question here from Don, which goes to that culture of cover-ups and what changes if Labor gets into government. So Don's asked, many people are saying there's no difference between the major parties. How do we counter this belief? I'm hearing people say, don't vote for the major parties, vote for anyone other than the majors. And what's your response to this dangerous proposition? So this sounds a bit like a Dixer, but it's not. Don has asked it. So, you know, why is Labor different and why is this proposal different?
In a word, we're different because we're going to do something about it. And that's why I said in my introductory words, it's a little bit of a distraction to get into this. You can call it a slinging match where Labor people say, those Liberal people are terrible, those Liberal people are corrupt, look at all the scandals on their watch. And then Liberal people will throw back, oh, look at that happened under a Labor state government, or this happened under a Labor state government. I'm not for a moment going to pretend that every Labor government since Federation has been without blemish. Clearly, they haven't. And it's a matter of shame to me as a committed and loyal servant of the Labor Party and a lifelong member of the Labor Party to think that members of my party as ministers have been engaged in corrupt conduct. But it's a fact, they have. And the difference at the moment between the Liberal government and our Labor opposition, which wants to win government at the next election, is we're going to do something about this. And I fully accept, and all of our colleagues in the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party fully accept, that it could end up catching someone in a future Labor government. And to which I say, good. To which I say, so be it. Because what I'm interested in, and I like to think my party and all my colleagues in the party are interested in, is raising standards of government in Australia. So that's what you can say to people who say, and it is a widely held view, oh, all the parties are the same, or politicians are all bad, or you get all sorts of things said like that. Whether that be true or not, and I don't think it is true, I don't think all politicians are the same, and I don't think all parties are the same, and I don't think one is as bad as the other. You'll hear all those phrases. I don't agree with that, but I'm not going to get distracted into an argument that's based around who's worse than the other or who's better than the other. Instead, I come straight back every time and say, we're going to do something about it. That's what people want to hear. That's why it's a hugely supported idea, more than most things I've actually been committed to in politics. There is huge levels of support for this. Not quite at the levels of support I remember when I went to argue the whaling case in The Hague, which was supported by about 99.99% of Australians. But this is right up there. Polling says to us that 90%, 85% of Australians right across Australia, in rural Australia, in regional Australia, in every state, Australians support a national anti-corruption commission. So my answer is we're going to do something about it, and we're not going to get distracted into arguments about who's worse.
That gets a massive here from me, Mark, particularly how you frame that, but also how you're talking about the fact that actually having this in place and having that system in place means it's not an argument about who's bad, who's done the wrong thing. It means there is something in place to deal with that. And it's certainly something I've been talking about recently in terms of bullying and sexual harassment in Parliament as well. The fact that we don't have a system in place to deal with that means that, you know, could be bad behaviour on either side, but we wouldn't know, and we don't have a process to deal with that. So I think that is absolutely the case. So big here from me, and also goes to some of the questions we've had as well about scope, and probably around some of the other reforms that Labor is proposing alongside of this. And I know not all of these fall into your portfolio area, but I'll ask you and we can sort of talk about how Labor's also looking at reforms in these areas. But Frank has asked, would you support ICAC to involve themselves into donations, into electoral issues from the AEC, into the influence of past MPs getting into private industry immediately after retiring? And what about the conduct and influence of lobbyists?
There's a big bag of issues there. You'll see in the principles that we've recently published, there's a reference to the interaction with the Independent Parliamentary Expenses Authority, that's IPEA. I don't want this National Anti-Corruption Commission to get bogged down looking at politicians' expenses. One of the reasons why this IPEA arrangement was set up was to improve standards, but also to provide guidance to federal MPs in how to deal with their expenses. But, and you'll see this in the principles, it's possible to conceive of activity that is so terrible, so corrupt and systemic in relation to the way in which a particular MP might have chosen to handle matters of expenses, that even though there is already existing an integrity body for politicians' expenses called IPEA, you need to provide a mechanism for IPEA, once it becomes aware of something that is at that gross level that's really bad, to be able to refer on that particular MP to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. Again, lobbyists it's a somewhat different issue, but there is the potential, obviously, because of what lobbyists do and their interactions with government, and particularly their interactions with ministers and senior public servants. Obviously, potentially, you could have corrupt activity, and the National Anti-Corruption Commission should be able to investigate that. We've got some ideas about lobbyists generally. At the moment, there's a non-legislated code of conduct for lobbyists and a register of lobbyists, which isn't, to my mind, working very well. If there's a lesson about this last 8 years of Liberal government, it's that we can't any longer rely on conventions and what I would have thought were commonly understood standards of conduct. And we'll be looking in government to possibly legislate about lobbyists as well, because if you can't rely on people in government behaving properly because of conventions or because of commonly understood standards of conduct, you need to legislate. The issue, and it's a long-standing issue, about ministers going off to work, particularly in industries, in senior positions that they themselves were involved in regulating when they were ministers, is something that up until now has been dealt with by the Statement of Ministerial Standards that are published by Prime Ministers. The Liberals have honoured this more in the breach than in the observance. We've had some terrible examples of senior ministers, think Andrew Robb going off to work for a Chinese enterprise soon after he was Trade Minister. That'd be one example, but there's lots of others. The statement of ministerial standards at the moment says you shouldn't do it within 2 years, but I can think of quite a number of examples of Liberal ministers going off to work for organisations that they were previously involved in regulating. We had the most appalling example in the case of Bruce Bilson, who was Minister for Small Business, who even before he had left the Parliament, but after he had ceased to be a minister, went to work for the Franchising Council while he was still in the Parliament, and is one of the very few members of Parliament in Australia to have been held to have breached privilege by the Privileges Committee of the House of Representatives. That's about 4 years ago. But again, if it's possible to show actual corruption that emerges from a minister who has gone after leaving Parliament to work for a company or an organisation that she or he was previously involved in regulating, that's something that the National Anti-Corruption Commission should be able to look at.
And donation reform was also in there, Mark, and
you're going to answer that,
as I know, yes, exactly.
I know you're going to answer that question.
That Labor is proposing reforms to donations, which include lowering the threshold at which you have to declare a donation, so that we get a better picture of all of who is donating to political parties, and also real-time donations. So people might be aware that at the moment you essentially wait a year after an election to find out who has donated.
18 months.
18 months, there you go.
Yeah.
So
Howard
far too long.
Yeah, Howard in government put a disclosure threshold of $10,000 and indexed it. It's presently up to around $14,000 because of that indexation. And that's the level below which you don't have to disclose at the federal level if you make a donation to a political party. Labor discloses everything over $1,000. But we've got a really good example. We're straying away from the National Anti-Corruption Commission, but just want to mention to people who are watching this webinar, have a look at what's happened in Queensland, where a Labor government has introduced, this is the Palaszczuk government, has introduced some really terrific donations reform, which coincidentally or curiously has produced a fantastic outcome in that it has made donations to the LNP, which is a combined federal and state body in Queensland, visible for the first time. And there's been some extraordinary disclosures because they have real-time disclosure and they have a much lower disclosure limit, and they have got very tight disclosure laws, which to my mind are improving the quality of government and politics in Queensland, but have had the coincidental effect of producing a whole lot of information about donations to the LNP, who operate, of course, at the federal level.
It is a really important area of reform alongside this work on anti-corruption. Mark, question from Rosemary about Helen Haynes' anti-corruption bill that's been introduced into Parliament, and where Labor stands on support for that bill and what the differences might be, if any, in the policies.
This bill's got a history. It's based on a bill that Cathy McGowan, Helen Haynes' independent predecessor as member for Indi, brought to the last Parliament. It never got voted on, but the bill, it's the same bill essentially as a bill that the Greens Party brought to the Senate as a private senator's bill brought by Senator Larissa Waters. And we did vote in favour of that bill in the Senate. I expect that we will vote, if it can be brought to a vote, we would vote for Helen Haynes' bill because it's close. It's not identical, but it's close to the principles that we have set forward since 2018 as to what we want to see in a National Anti-Corruption Commission. There's a slight difference in the model that Helen's got in her bill, which is that she's got a whistleblower protection authority built in, to the bill. And my own view about this is that we need to keep them to some extent separate. When we passed the Public Interest Disclosure Act in 2013, I provided in the bill for a review. That review took place by an eminent public servant who reported to the government in 2017. The government has never responded to the review done by Philip Moss. So that's a work in progress. I'd rather look at those reforms than possibly overcomplicate the National Anti-Corruption Commission by building in the whistleblower protection scheme. That said, there's obviously a need to protect whistleblowers. We've got it already at the general level in the Commonwealth Government with the Public Interest Disclosure Scheme, but you would need to provide additional protections to people who came forward from inside the public service to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. And again, it's going back to something I said at the start of this webinar. There's lots of examples in state legislation setting up anti-corruption commissions that offer really good models for how you go about protecting people who come forward. But it's clearly a really important feature.
And it is worth noting that Labor can't bring bills forward. So even if we are supporting Helen's bill, it's the government who decides what gets voted on and what gets debated on the floor. And I know that's a question that I get both on this and other bills that independents bring forward as well.
Helen's bill technically has lapsed. So she brought it to the Parliament, she gave a speech, and it never got brought on for debate. As Kate's just explained, we don't control what comes on for the debate in the House. She could bring it back. We could have another speech by her, but it would lapse again unless the government agreed that it could be debated. The Senate's different because the government does not control the process fully in the Senate because it doesn't have an absolute majority. It relies on the support of crossbench. And if we can persuade, and we often can, persuade the Greens Party and the crossbench to vote with us, then we can bring on for debate certain private senators' bills.
Which brings us to a related question from David, which is about possible Senate makeup and what you think crossbenchers might do on a National Anti-Corruption Commission. At
the moment, I've given a press conference attended by all members of the crossbench, including Pauline Hanson and her offsider, Malcolm Roberts. All of us spoke in favour. So I spoke in favour, Greens Party, Larissa Waters spoke in favour, and all of the Senate crossbench were there, and Helen Haines came, this is about 18 months ago, late 19, so pre-pandemic, that's why no one can remember it. I'm confident that the current crossbench in the Senate, all 5 of them, would support a National Anti-Corruption Commission. But this is all speculation because we don't know, assuming we can win the next election, we don't know what the makeup of the Senate's going to be. I have been asked, do you think it would get blocked in the Senate? And the short answer is I don't think so. We will come to the next election, and if we are successful, we will have the clearest possible mandate to introduce a National Anti-Corruption Commission. Maybe we'll get some dickering about the detail, but there will not be, particularly in circumstances where the Liberal Party claims to be itself committed to a National Anti-Corruption Commission, I would not be expecting blanket opposition by any Senate. It'd be a brave, newly elected Senate that tried to block a newly elected Labor government with a very clear mandate to do something that is very popular around Australia.
Yes, I would agree with you on that, saying that you're not going to vote for that when we've taken it to election it would be a very big call. I think we've got time for one last question, Mark, before we sum up. And Judy's asked again about the scope of the proposed commission, which is whether members of the general public would be able to refer in inquiries, or whether it would have to come from some kind of official source.
No, it would definitely, you would have members of the public, all public servants or anybody being able to make an allegation to the commission, including on an anonymous basis, if need be. I can remember discussing this with the late David Ip, the former commissioner of the New South Wales ICAC, who died last year. And he used to say to me that he had learned by long experience that it was really important to provide, when you're setting up a commission like this, for it to be able to act on anonymous complaints. Because sometimes someone who knows something will be in so much fear about their own well-being if their identity became known to the people that they are reporting on, that they need to be able to make the complaint anonymously. And it's a matter for the commission and the wisdom or the discretion of the commissioner to decide whether to look into something. And that's often part of the difficulty of these commissions. You've got to make that difficult decision. Is there enough in this complaint? Is there enough in this allegation that I should now devote some resources to investigating it further?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone. I think having more than 70 people participate in this chat tonight demonstrates just how much need, commitment, want there is for a proper National Anti-Corruption Commission out there. And it's been really helpful, Mark, to have you be able to answer these questions about scope, about how it would be set up, about how it would be enforced, but also to really go to the heart of why Labor is proposing this and why we think this is such a central plank of what would make a Labor government different and make our country stronger going forward. So thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all the questions that were there tonight, but I really appreciate everything that people have put forward, and really appreciate all of you joining the discussion tonight. It is really important. It's a topic that I will continue to be very interested in and committed to. So if you do want to contact me and ask me further questions via email, absolutely happy to get back to you on all of those. And on that note, yes, thank you, everyone. And Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate, for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Good night.